I want to try something on this episode. So I gave someone a compliment the other day and said specifically, hey, did you know like this is something you're really good at? And they, of course they kind of knew, but no one had really called that out. And so it meant a lot to them. And I thought, man, there's so many times where we ghost for such a long time without really hearing what we're good at. So I was recently on a trip with Ashley and we were doing this with each other at dinner and kind of just giving each other little shout outs on like accomplishments that the other person had. It was really fun because obviously we know the accomplishments that we've had, but a bunch of them we had never said it to the other person. It actually felt really good to hear her say, I'm really proud of you and I'm impressed with like how you did this. And so I want to try starting the Sweetspot challenge. And the idea is you just tag someone here and say, hey, this is something I think you're really good at. Tag a friend, a coworker, and just remind them, what do you always notice that they're really good at? Because maybe they know it and it would just be encouraging, or maybe they've lost sight of it, or maybe no one's actually ever pointed that out. If you're listening to the podcast, maybe just take a sec, pause, text it to a friend. But I think it would be cool to have people just call out, like, what is something I think you're really good at that's a sweet spot for you?
So as an illustration, I think you should tag me so that the listeners know how to do this.
You should probably go above and beyond too. So I'm thinking maybe 15, 20, 30, 40 comments about all the things that's great about Sunday.
That's right. They need it a couple times to know how it works.
Lead by example here.
I have a TikTok, so feel free.
Anyone who's listening and wants to know, if you know Steve at all, ask him, DM him, ask him, what am I good at? Get Greenhouse to comment. Honestly, though, I do love this idea a lot. Obviously, it's not a brand new idea to Greenhouse.
But people don't take the time enough to say, gosh darn it, I like your t-shirt.
Thank you. Go Niners. I do think that everyone to some degree, whether you like public affirmation or not,
it feels good.
It feels good to know that other people think you're good at something. And it's very helpful to know, this isn't something that everyone's good at. Like, I think that's a trap that I fall into a lot. I'm like, I'm good at this, but so is everyone, and everyone likes that.
Okay, so maybe we should should we just do it as well? I'll start. I'll compliment you guys.
That means we have to compliment Steve?
You don't have to. You can just sit there in awkward silence afterward, and then we'll slowly transition.
Make the cricket noise.
I'm going back to producing, everyone.
Some music starts fading in.
Yeah.
Well, okay, I'll start right now.
Oh, we're doing this right now.
Right now.
We're doing it.
So, Sunday, I think something you're really good at, that everyone who knows you knows, is you are actually a really good listener. And what I think is cool about that is you're great at talking. So you might think you're not great at listening. You're actually one of the best listeners I know. And you have a way of making people feel like you are so present right here with me. And you heard not just like what I said, but you really saw me. Like, you have a really sweet spot of being able to listen well. Take it. Just take the compliment.
Say thank you very much.
And Joe, I actually think you have one that's similar but different. You are really good at
similar but different, where you're really good at the talking and just the
You're
listening.
not so much of a listener.
Just kidding.
You're really good at making people feel comfortable though, because you have you're so not judgmental. Like you feel, you know how you can kind of feel if someone's being a little judgy.
Staring at you.
Like there is just a feeling of hanging out with you that you're so open and you're so not judgmental. It's really fun to be around you. I mean, you're also good at like baseball and snowboarding and surfing and but that's something.
That honestly, that's really encouraging though for me to hear, because in the studio space, that's something that I've always wanted to do, is create an environment where people come in and they're comfortable. And so often studios in general are very intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
Music, that's what I wanted to do originally.
Nope,
so that was the thought.
here.
But so that even just doing this right now is very encouraging.
Yeah.
So, Steve, coming at you right now, because Sunday, you stole mine for Sunday. I wanted to say it immediately. Everyone feels comfortable with Sunday.
Oh, immediately.
Immediately.
Yeah.
You just walk in, you listen, and everyone's like, Sunday's my best friend.
I immediately feel comfortable right now.
But Steve, I've had the pleasure of being coached by both of y'all. But one of the things that I love, since it's Steve's turn now, Sunday, that it's hard to listen to someone's vision, especially for a company and things that you're really excited about. And I remember that when you coached me, you got the picture of everything that I wanted it to be one day. And everyone that I've talked to, there's always a disconnect somewhere. They grasp part of it and put it in a box. And I felt like you understood that, and then were able to help me deconstruct that and like reverse engineer it some. And it's really encouraging that you're helping other people do that, because for me, it was a huge deal. So
thanks, man.
Yeah, you're good at your job.
I mean, I'm also very good at lifting weights and
You are.
You're good at snowboarding, even though you took someone out.
Yeah.
When we were going down.
oh my God,
Did you see that?
I forgot Joe was there.
That was funny.
Okay, we both love snowboarding. Neither of us are pros, but we're both like decent, right? We're good. We don't fall down a lot.
We can go down anything we want to. Like we're.
Oh my God!
Did you
took
wipe
this lady out.
Oh.
I took her out
Like,
at the knees,
Oh, shoot.
and I thought no one was around, and Joe was right behind me watching the whole thing.
Did you video it?
Then he helped her get up, and then just rode past me laughing.
It was because they were starting to blow snow. So it was getting like a little bit wide out. Then she was cutting straight across, and then you'd hit like a little jump and like skidded on ice. And so you bounce back up, and then you're landing on ice right when you see her, and you try to cut, and you just completely lost your edge.
Yeah.
And then.
Well, yeah, you're right, because I was trying to fall on purpose so I wouldn't just like run right into her. But in doing so, I kind of slid and took her out at the knees. And so it was like a cartoon where she just went flying straight back in the air.
Was so mad.
Oh, she was so pissed at me.
I was like, I do not know, Steve, but let me help.
Furious. Yeah, she was, I forget what she said, but kind of yelling at me. And yeah, I was like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But actually at the same time, I had really hurt my knee. I was like,
right.
Oh, God.
It was hurting for a couple days. Like, was it a week or two after?
Yeah,
like you were,
this is why
really,
I'm not going
you were
snowboarding.
the victim here.
And Joe
Your
saw the
feet
whole
are
thing.
locked into a board.
Oh.
Like,
I see your face and I see the words that you're saying, and they're just not adding up to me. I'm like, yeah, that's awesome. You're locked into a board. My brothers nailed wakeboarding boots onto a skateboard so that they could do flips like off a swing and land. So
oh, wow.
that's like my idea of fun.
See, this is
And
what
you're
I love
saying
about
it like it's a
Joe. Joe,
negative.
you're surprisingly, you're just surprising. That's what I feel like. I feel like Joe has layers.
Yeah.
You're like very serious about your work, and you're very neat and organized, and yet you're kind of crazy.
Oh,
like
very
you do
crazy.
all these risk-taking, insane
Or like what
things,
he's got next.
but yet you never make people feel rushed because you're headed somewhere.
Man, this
very
is
present.
this is my favorite episode
It
we've
is
ever
because
done.
you're feeling the love, right?
But if you're listening or watching this, it doesn't have to be really
Right.
deep or elaborate. It could just be, honestly, especially if it's a coworker, something they're actually just a skill they're good at
Yeah.
work. It can be helpful to hear that.
So like Steve, I just got to observe you yesterday, simply.
That's right.
And I wasn't even like, I didn't even have a big role. You let me just watch you.
It's not hard to observe
And it was,
me.
let me be clear where I observed you.
This is a workplace.
You were facilitating a group on strategic planning.
That just took a hard left
People are
turn.
like, I was excited until I wasn't.
That's great.
You let it well.
Thanks.
Simply just let it well. And I could not believe how excited this group was about.
Well, I think they had rarely had someone prep and be prepared to lead a meeting, and so be confidently leading through and keeping the time. And yeah, like Joe, you had something similar. You led a meeting for us on some kind of marketing and ideas, and we all at the end were like, damn, nice job. Like, Joe, when you put your mind to it, you're really good at leading a meeting, because you had kind of some slides prepared with some visuals and ideas, and you were guiding us through the time and kind of taking ownership and being the boss. And we were like, yes, this is so good.
Yeah.
Or even something that Robin's really good at. She doesn't get enough shout outs here.
No.
She is so good at
She's
anticipating
everything.
things. And she's so good at anticipating and being kind of a couple steps ahead.
Yeah.
We'll be in a meeting and we're like, oh, what about? And she's like,
She's like,
done.
Done.
Already done.
She today, she already knew our sandwich orders. She already anticipates what we want to order.
Yeah.
I love that.
So
Right.
good.
And one more thing about you is you are really great at being a boss and also a friend. Like when you go out of town, I'm like, my friend's back. I'm like so excited. And you're a great boss.
Thank you.
Like that's not always easy.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a funny
you
one.
manage that well.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is fun to just hear something you're good at, maybe whether you know it or not. So if you're listening, stop right now and text a friend or a coworker and just tell them like what's something that's their sweet spot. Sweet spot challenge.
Go for it.
I'm so glad you're on, Rebecca, because we realized recently there's some really fun, awesome coaches at Greenhouse that no one out there has met yet. So I'm glad people get to hear your voice, see your face, and like hear from you a little bit. I want to ask, like I always start with anyone who's a guest, what was your very first job? Your very first job?
I love that. Well, I'm happy to be here. And I'm one of those people that has sort of had, whether it be formal jobs or volunteer kind of jobs, pretty early in my life. My very first job, though, was at a bakery. So I was helping an auntie of ours. She brought me under her wing. It was a very famous bakery around here. It's called B-Bell, unfortunately closed. But I did the morning shift with her. And so I packed cheese buns for their distribution to like the grocery stores around the city in the early hours for a whole summer. It was lovely because the team was great there. It was not so great because I probably didn't eat bread for a few years after that. And like to this day, like cheese buns look amazing, but I just
can't do them.
I just can't. Yeah. I know how good they are, but it's just not for me. So that's what happens when you go home smelling like bread every day for 6 months, right?
Okay, so this is not nearly as cool as like a Vancouver, like amazing bakery. But I had, I worked at a company I worked at for a little while. They were like in the same building with some nonprofit that would collect all the leftover Panera bread every week and then give it to the homeless. So it was kind of a cool thing because Panera, you think these restaurants, they have so much left over that they have to throw away. And so they'd collect it, but then they would let us get dibs on it too. And so we could pick up a loaf. It's terrible saying that outside. So I had Panera bread so many times in a row. I can't even go to Panera anymore. But at least your bread was a little higher quality.
It's like the opposite, right?
Yeah. Yes. My dream is to like live next to a bakery where you could just walk over there every morning.
Oh, and it would just smell delicious every day. I feel like that would just start my day off with such joy.
That's so cool. Okay. Well, so maybe just give a quick introduction, who you are, where you live, how you even got connected to Greenhouse. I think sometimes people are surprised that we have a team spread around so much. And I think what I especially want to hear is a bit of your career path, because so many of the listeners they feel like they're the only one with a windy career path and think that everyone's is linear and goes perfectly straight and as expected, and find a lot of encouragement or just affirmation in hearing other people's stories that are not linear, that are actually kind of the generalist, the Swiss Army knife, can play a lot of roles. So sometimes you don't know exactly where you fit, but you do a lot of cool work now. So maybe just share a bit of that background for people.
Yeah, for sure. I love that call out. And one thing that maybe I'll start off with is, and I learned this probably just in the second half of my career, right? But of course, when you grow up, you're told to go to school, you're told to pick a major, they give you all these assessments, or people in your life give you assessments of like, oh, like you like people, maybe go into HR, like, because that's what happened with me, right? Like I wanted to do creative things. My parents were like, you need to actually get a job and not be an artist. And so they're like, how about, doctor? How about law school? How about business school? These types of things, which is all great. But now that I'm a little bit older, I like to think that with lived experience, the reality is a lot of the interesting jobs that exist today, frankly, didn't exist 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. And so what does that look like when it comes to that kind of career laddering, career pathing? I'm not saying that those don't help from a foundational perspective to kind of, give you exposure to different things, give you exposure to topics so that you can apply skills like problem solving and being creative within that space. But the reality is, if we stick too close to certain industries or certain paths of today, who knows what's going to happen 5, 10, 15 years from now. And so I think it's important to be flexible, like you say, Steve. So for me, again, I did kind of, grew up in circles and in a family that very much encouraged us to, go to school and like be able to get a job out of school. right? Of course, in hindsight, looking back, like I loved the journey that I took in education because it allowed me to learn all these interesting things. But in the moment, I was really stressed out about coming out and like getting a co-op job and starting my career.
Yeah.
So I am kind of, more traditionally trained in HR because of all those assessments that I had mentioned previously. I'm glad that it ended up the way that it did, because I would say that it's not so much that I'm a people person. I often joke that I'm probably the least HRy person that people may meet in HR. But the reason why I really enjoy the profession that I have continued in is because I like to work with people, but it's not so much being a people person. Right. And often, especially early in my career, I often felt like I was a little bit too cold for HR. Like I didn't have like that strong, heart-led way, all like leaning into the feelings. Like I'm actually more of an analytical thinker.
Yeah.
But what excites me is unpacking how human behavior works. How does the human brain work? And so my HR career has been very much around chasing really interesting problems. So business problems with that people lens.
Yeah.
So I've kind of progressed my career within the people space with that in mind. So not so much the operational HR, but looking for juicy problems like policy development, like talent data, and what kind of people data do we need to present in front of executives in order to make sense of what's going on in your business.
Yeah.
I also forayed into strategy related to diversity and inclusion, which I really enjoyed. And as of late, I've spent the last 5 to 7 years in tech. And so both in large as well as small companies, which really allows me to color outside the lines when it comes to the people space, because tech is kind of all things. And so there's really interesting opportunities to lean into the business problems in that tech world, again, with that people lens. So thank goodness the world has turned the corner. And I think most companies recognize that your people in your business are literally your business. And so it allows a lot of space to work in this way.
Yeah.
You had also asked about how we came across each other. So maybe this will come up later on, in pandemic. Obviously, everything shut down and there were lots of pros and cons. I look back at that time with a lot of blessings came into my life. And so one of those was the opportunity to take part in a coaching program out of Howard University. And so again, that likely wouldn't have been on my radar if, virtual programs were not a thing. And so of course, being able to log in and complete this certification by distance was such a treat. And so after that program, someone else that was in that program is actually who connected Steve and I. So really glad that everything kind of fell the way that it has. And it allowed me to kind of lean into this space, which again allows me to dive into really juicy problems, right? My whole career has been spent chasing juicy problems. And in coaching, it's just a different lens and scope. So it's more, as opposed to helping organizations unpack their problems, it's helping individuals get under the surface of what's happening.
Yeah, that's cool. And it makes sense. There's something about coaching, which is if you enjoy that type of problem solving in your own life and experience, at some point it becomes fun and fulfilling to help others work through that stuff too, because there's so many layers and so much complexity to the kind of things we tackle in coaching.
That's right.
Well, that's cool. So I want to talk about boundaries today. I'm actually really interested in where we're going to go here, because I think it is a coaching topic that is getting a little more attention or dialogue now, as opposed to your point, maybe 5 years ago. It's something I've been thinking through and working on myself a lot. And I consider myself just at the baby stages of it. But it's been really helpful to start to explore those areas in my personal life, my work life. I would love to hear a bit of your story around boundaries. Like, what's been your journey so far with it?
That's a great call out. And I mean, full disclosure, I would not suggest that I'm an expert in this space at all. And I would suggest that most people, like with most things around human behavior, it's always going to be an ongoing journey, right? Yeah. So maybe just to take a step back, I am a mom. We have 3 relatively young kids. And I think when the whole topic of boundaries kind of became more viral, I would suggest again in the past, 5 to 7 years, let's say,
Yeah.
we were like in it, right? Like at the time, probably pandemic-ish timeframe. We're located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And so during those years, that looked like everything was on shutdown. No schools, no daycare. You're still working your full-time job and you're essentially homeschooling your kids virtually. If the kids were a little bit older, I think that might have been okay. In that time though, like we had a 2-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 6-year-old. So it was a lot, right? And so I would share that when the whole topic of boundaries came up for me, I sometimes felt like I started at the very bottom of the barrel because we were coming out of this space of, frankly, raising young kids. And so what does it look like to create boundaries with these little beings that truly need all of you?
Yeah.
Versus now that they're a little bit older, we can start to have more complex conversations about,
my gosh.
everybody's got different needs and,
Yeah.
we have to fill all the different buckets. When they're just depending on you for everything, like it's not a thing, right?
It's not a thing. Well, this is it. I'm just realizing right now, you and I have never talked about some of these things, but it's funny because for me, it was similar but different, where we only have one young kid, but it was still the birth of that child that forced me to even start thinking about boundaries. Before that,
Yeah.
I was one of these people where every night, every weekend was just packed with stuff. And I've always been all in with work. So I always had, in fact, I used to be chronically late to everything simply because I was running from something else. I just always packed the time full. And StrengthsFinder, I'm a maximizer. So it was like, I just, without thinking from my youngest age, that was just my way of being in life, was pack your schedule. And it was the birth of Lucy and the realities that you're talking about that even had me start thinking about boundaries. And I didn't even, that word wasn't the thing for me. It wasn't like, oh, boundaries and we need to have, here's my framework. It was just, oh, on the weekend, I can't pack full of stuff anymore or else I'm going to die. It's like the need for mental space or rest or any of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a good call out that those of us, we're navigating life with others, right? And I think as a parent, especially, and don't get me wrong, like early on when they're little and they kind of have to follow you around, you figure like, okay, they're a ticking time bomb, but like, it's okay. Like you'll just carry them and like, it's fine. When they get older, like those coping mechanisms are gone. And so you have to start respecting that everyone is an individual with different needs and preferences and all the rest of it. And so I think that, especially the last few years navigating mom life, but also navigating, to your point, balancing all the different hats that we wear, all the spinning plates on any given day has really inspired me to force myself to take that step back and frankly, really truly lean into self-care.
Yeah.
Right. So for me, boundaries is about self-care. And as a perpetual people pleaser, right? Like someone that is a bit of a giver, wants to kind of, help out wherever I can, however I can. Things have always been quite out of balance in that way. And that was just the way that I was either trained or brought up. I don't know exactly where it came from. I haven't unpacked that yet, but working through it, right? Because at the end of the day, like, how am I treating myself in comparison to how I'm hoping to treat others? And that has been the journey for me, which is probably the very first foundational block of like, what is it that I need? I don't always have an answer for that.
Yeah.
And I don't always give myself permission to even think about that.
Yes,
so that's
is
where I'm at.
Huge. Well, yeah. And I know that most of our listeners fall in that general category, people helpers, or you enjoy helping, you are others centered, which is great, a great quality. But same thing, I've been unpacking this big time lately, and it does feel new to me, a lot of new realizations that I've never even been good at sharing my needs with others, verbalizing them, recognizing them, because I don't know, I'm a pretty high capacity person. I like just helping out. If I see a problem, I go solve it. It's just, and so I've started noticing lately, to your point, in interactions with family and friends, I've started kind of just paying attention and noticing that my default mode is to just get rid of any discomfort that they have and like spend myself in the, honorable act of caring for everybody else. And to your point, what happens is the opposite. I can wear myself out. I can crumble, and then of course not be able to help others either. But I'm just starting to recognize that a lot more myself as well.
So
I like that call it. Sorry, go ahead.
No, this is bringing up so many questions. But okay, so kids have played a big role for you in starting to recognize and think about self-care. Are there other catalysts or things that have started to turn the light bulb on for you?
Yeah, I think for me, it has been the balance of all things, right? So again, I mentioned being a mom, and I find that when they are little, it's, at least for me, it was easy to kind of treat that as like, okay, this is my season in life. That was the priority. And, we're going to do this for a bit and then we're going to go back to our career, right? Because I've always been very career driven, always very busy in that way. And don't really want to miss a beat when it comes to that, which is why in my mind, I was compartmentalizing my life. Now that they're not little anymore and I don't have that excuse in some ways of like, oh, like they're little, I need to prioritize them. Now it's back to balancing all the things, except you have this huge role, which frankly is the biggest role of my life, that sometimes comes into conflict with the other pieces. And I think that's why for me, it's kind of forced this, the inner work and my own personal journey of what is it that I need in order to show up in the best way, right?
Yeah.
What is on my plate, what's important, and what maybe needs to drop. Sometimes as well is, you talk about, the time that we have and having a busy schedule and those types of things. For me, we tried that, right? We tried to take a look at it and like, what are we going to cut so that we can have more time? And my aha moment in that was I didn't do that self-reflection of why are these things in my calendar in the first place, right? Busyness or not being busy does not equal having healthy boundaries, at least in my definition, right? My definition around boundaries is how clear are we in terms of what we need when it comes to time, space, relationships, and how do our lives reflect that? And so sometimes having a busier week than others, for example, but filling that week with things that are really important to me or to one person, another person in the family, and making sure that we're catering those experiences in that way.
Yeah.
Even if it's busy, that can actually be us maintaining that boundary because we're prioritizing our needs in that space.
Right? I love that. I love that framing of it. It is really helpful because sometimes if we say, I'm just going to make more time, I'm going to clear up time, it just fills with other stuff.
Exactly.
And even if it doesn't fill with stuff, to your point, you might not be doing anything better with that time. You're just filling it with Netflix or something. And I think that I've been experiencing a similar thing. Every year I try to set goals, but also set a theme for the year, which is more this meta like topic that I'm just going to be mindful of. Yeah. And this year I had two, so I broke my rule. Okay. But it was around marriage and friendships, and I tried to I set more of an intention around being thoughtful about our marriage and investing in that relationship and a few specific friendships. And as someone who would have just said yes to any invite that comes my way before, I found myself saying no a lot this year and felt uncomfortable because I don't want to upset anyone or be rude. But it's been so good because those relationships I wanted to focus on have gotten to whole new levels. I mean, the amount of growth is just insane that I don't think any goal setting could have done, but just the intentionality you're talking about has, not even a year yet, made such a difference.
That's really cool to hear. That's really cool to hear. And it reminds me that as you dive into the journey of not just establishing boundaries, but also maintaining boundaries, that it can get uncomfortable, especially if you're talking about relationships or spaces that were one way before. And then you kind of dive into this work and now you're like, okay, like things need to change, but there's work required to do that, right? Like it's not as easy to say like, okay, so, it's a new week. these are now the things that I need because I've had this amazing journaling, session by myself. And so you communicate those things and you just like, things don't just shift overnight.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why for me, that intentionality, that reflection, whatever we want to call it, but having some of that time for that inner work and then having something that becomes almost like our North Star to pressure test everything against, for me, it gives me confidence in standing behind that boundary when things get a little bit ugly or tough.
Yeah.
But it also it makes sure that I'm aligned in that conviction of like when it gets hard, why am I still stuck on this boundary, right? Like if I didn't spend that time on the front end of it to really unpack why I need it and why it's so important, it'd be so much easier to just default back to like, okay, like I got to do all things for everybody because that's the way it's always been, right?
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes that foundational piece, it takes a little bit more time, but it becomes something that I go back to as well, like you say.
Yeah. What I hear you saying is, and boundaries have this negative connotation sometimes. It's like a downer. It's like we got to put more rules on it. We got to cut out fun stuff. But what I hear you saying is priorities create boundaries. And if I'm setting priorities well, it'll naturally help to create the right boundaries versus just putting boundaries in for the sake of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think for me, my journey through this topic has been, because I too always heard boundaries as like a negative thing. And if I was setting a boundary, I'd be like, oh, like, is that mean? Like, am I being rude? Again, because I wasn't naturally that way of, frankly, knowing what I needed, or requiring other people to meet that need for me. And so the turning point for me was around alignment, right? So you say priorities. Another topic or another word that I sometimes like to use is like my values, right? So like if you dive into that values work, like what are those top 3 values? And that becomes the way I want to make sure my life looks and feels like at any point in time. Then that becomes the measuring stick for these types of conversations, these decisions. What is that boundary that's going to help me maintain or work towards bringing that value to life? Versus just kind of ebbing and flowing with everybody that you engage with and interact with every day.
Yeah, it makes me think of when we're working on values with an organization, we always talk about how you have to lose something in order for it to be a value. If setting that value doesn't cause you to lose anything on the other end of it, then it's not a real value. It's just a, hey, good attitude and, we have a supportive environment. It's like, well, if doing that and living that out doesn't cause you to have to give up anything, it's not really a value. And I think that speaks to having those personal values aligned. It does kind of force other things out. And even the other day, I was finding myself having to say no to something that was in relation to this. And I was worried about what that person was going to think. And it was a funny little moment of just remembering, all I have to do is explain to them why I'm saying no. Because they'll understand in this circumstance, like they'll understand the why and they'll be supportive. But yeah, if I just spit it out like, no, because I hate you, that's of course not going to come across the same way as, no, there's reasoning behind why I'm making these decisions and it's actually for good things.
Yeah, that's such a good call out. And that reminds me of something. So this is new.
Okay.
I've got 2 girls, and I forget where I picked this up from. Embarrassingly, it might be from the Kardashians or something like that. So it's from, pop culture.
Yep.
But it was a comment around how they were talking about their parents, and their biggest takeaway was that they were always taught early on that like no is a complete sentence. You know what? It wasn't the Kardashians. It was like Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen. And I heard that and I was like, that is so interesting because like, where would I be in life if I had leaned into that early on, right? Like, because often I'm like you, like I'll like, it'll take me time to come to that decision. And then I'll think about sort of, how are people going to feel if I like land on this decision? And then I try to craft like the perfect, not like an excuse, but like, the narrative, like I want to give them a reason as opposed to like, no, like it's okay to just say no.
Yeah.
And to be confident in that. And anyway, so I'm trying to gift that to my girls is what I'm trying to say.
That's great. It helps me to hear it too, because I've been working through that and I have to remind myself especially if I'm saying no to someone. Let's say they're invited me to do something and I'm really trying to keep the weekend open and I'm going to say no. I mean, that was very painful for me at first. That was the hardest thing to learn because I never said no. And it's all about keeping everyone happy and pleased. And
Right.
And what's so funny to me is I try to remind myself they are not sitting around like thinking about me. They're busy with their own life. And when I say no, they're probably going to move on to the next thing and not even give it another thought. Meanwhile, I'm stewing for days like, oh, did I make them mad?
That's such a good call out.
Not all the time, but you get the point. Sometimes that we can overinflate it in our own head.
Yeah. Everyone's got their own reality, right? And,
Yeah.
Anyway, as you say the word meta, it kind of goes into that realm of like, okay, it gets very philosophical here, but that's very much the way it is. Like everyone views the world in their own way.
Yeah.
And so how do we get better in stitching those very sometimes different realities together to actually meet in the middle? And that's probably more reflective of the true story that we're all living.
So when you're coaching someone around this, I'm just curious your thoughts on this, because I think there is a pendulum swing happening where maybe previous generations had no concept of boundaries, and now younger generations are like, it's all about boundaries, and they're actually, I think it enters into unreasonable territory or selfish territory, and it's, of course, there's a spectrum. So I'm just curious how you approach that in coaching someone. Where is the right place for boundaries and how to think about it?
Yeah, I love that. I think that it comes up in a bunch of different ways. Where I notice, like the first flag for me, where maybe this is a topic that we want to lean into is when they can't seem to answer questions around whatever topic. But I often like to ask people, like, what is it that you need? You know, like, what is it that you need in this scenario? And often people can really struggle with that. I mean, I struggle with it for sure all the time.
Yeah.
Right. And so for me, that's kind of the first inkling where I'm like, oh, like maybe we need to dive a little bit deeper into this. And so that's one of the questions that I always like to come back to, right? Because for me, boundaries is all back to that. It's about, making sure that you are clear on what it is that you need to fill your cup, to feel a certain way, to feel good. Again, in relation to whether it be time or space or your calendar or your relationships. But we need to be clear on what it is that we need to put on the table before we start making decisions around that need, right? And the second step, I think, for me is I always like to start with values. If people are not clear and if people are not able to answer that question clearly, or if it kind of seems like it's very situation dependent, which is valid. I mean, that's reality. But to have a golden thread that actually runs through the way we navigate life and the way that we make decisions, I think is just so valuable, right? Because at the end of the day, if we kind of ebb and flow and almost change how we show up or what our needs are, frankly, depending on the scenario, I'm not entirely sure how good we'll feel at the tail end of that, right?
Yeah.
I would venture to say that if you're putting on different hats and different personas all the time, as opposed to being clear and confident in who you are and what your needs are, that probably feels more exhausting than you going through a busy week and feeling more in alignment, right? So I like to go to values, help people prioritize. Maybe it's like their top 3 to 5. And then we talk through what those look like, right? Like, what does that actually look like in your life? What does it mean for you? If you think ease is a top value for you, like it is for me, what does that look like? And what does it feel like? And let's unpack that. Then let's go back to the problem that you're trying to solve for and trying to create some boundaries around. And I think that gives people context, not just about the situation at hand, but also around, the bigger picture, which is, how we want to feel at the end of the day, right? Day in and day out.
Okay, so can I ask you to give people an example, like that value for you, ease? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, so for me, this is where the people pleasing comes out still a little bit, because some of the ease is making sure that there is peace, right, in the interactions that I have. But for me, what that looks like is I try my best to hold space to have conversations similar to coaching conversations, where I'm also trying to understand what other people are needing. Right. So in order for me to be able to navigate, let's say, a project team that has a bunch of different personalities on it. In order to make sure that that process to getting to the product that we're trying to get at the end of the day, it goes in that in the realm of ease in life. Sorry, I'm tripping on my words here.
That's okay.
That requires us to know each of the individuals,
Yeah.
right? What are the working styles? How do we want to communicate? What's important to them? Maybe it's even, getting more personal about like, hey, what's your dog's name? Like, what kind of, right? Because building that rapport is going to make it easier in order to dive into the work. For me, it's about that, and taking the time to, take that step back, unpack all the different players that we need to be considering, or if it's a topic more around time and space, right? Like, okay, well then what does our calendar look like right now? If it's too crazy, there is going to be no ease, right? So for us in the calendar space, it's about having a more regular routine, right? So it becomes second nature. We don't have to think about it all the time. We're not moving things around all the time. For me, we have a crazy busy calendar. There's 5 of us, but there is ease in that, in my opinion, because it's always the same every week, right?
Yeah.
And so if something new comes up, we're not having to plug things around and look at it like a net new problem. It's, we have 3 open spots. If it fits in one of those spots, then great. If it doesn't, then it's a no, and for me, that seems easy, so.
Yeah. That's helpful to hear. And do you think about boundaries? What are the categories? Like, we're talking about time as one of them, and priorities, what we say yes and no to. Do you think about different categories of boundaries?
I think absolutely, for sure. Time and space, I would say, is one of them. Priorities is another one, and values, I would kind of check those 2 together. The relationship one, I think, is one that maybe we haven't dove too much into. But I think that one's probably the most complex, where you have to navigate, what is that relationship dynamic that you have with these individuals? Relationships also have different categories of their own. Right? So some relationships where, maybe it's your partner, this work is going to be a little bit more messy and probably a lot more complex because you depend on each other. And there's, there's a lot of things that are depending on that versus, I have a concept that I like to call almost like my personal board of directors. So I have a group of girlfriends that are all kind of from different walks of life. And, I like to pull them together. I like to use them as thinking partners and lean on them, when things get tough. The relationship there is quite different when it comes to that boundary, right? And the small group of us, lots of it is on chat, of course, but it kind of, there's a flow in there because we're diving into these conversations. We're getting to know each other in a way beyond, just going for coffee or catching up or diving into, a work project and those types of things. So I think at the end of the day, it comes to those relationships and really deepening those relationships. And I venture to say that maybe some of this boundary work is coming through naturally as a result of just deepening the relationships, really getting to know each other better.
I agree. I have a similar group of friends, and what happens is, in hearing what others are processing or working on or struggling with, creates light bulb moments for me and vice versa, because maybe they're thinking about a category I haven't thought about before, or they're working on a boundary or something that I haven't yet. And then I leave thinking about that, and it kind of sharpens each other. But I want to almost circle back to where we started this, which is around what's changed in the last several years. I don't know about you. I think, where have I been? How come I'm only now starting to think about boundaries at 37 years old? Like, how have I missed this? Am I behind? And some people have never thought about them. Or I just think it's interesting that where we're at with technology, where we're at even post-pandemic, where careers can be you have this and I have this too, where it's a collection of different jobs, not just one employer, same time every day. But we also have technology and access all the time. And all of these categories create more demand on our attention. So to me, it actually makes sense that boundaries is a more important topic to be intentional about than it might have been in the past. And the reason I started noticing that was, as Ashley and I have been working on some of this stuff together, we realized, oh, wow, if we're going to work on that intention of our marriage and our relationship, we actually need to trim out or create some boundaries around other stuff that is just by default consuming all of our attention. So we had this funny conversation recently about something we were talking about, and neither of us had even thought about it since we talked about it. And it was almost, we stepped back and dissected it, and it was interesting that the only reason is because our attention has been fully occupied by so many other things, and most of it unnecessary. It wasn't just work. It was also scrolling and all these other things. So I don't know if that gives people a permission slip as well. It's okay if you haven't even ever thought about this before to start now. I feel like I'm just starting now.
100%. Thank you for sharing that, because that makes me feel better too.
Okay.
I often would have that aha and be like, do I just feel the need to lean into like my own needs because I feel like I'm drowning, like several years ago, like that's what it felt like. And I remember I was on a call with my coaches, and I was having a breakdown. And it was simply because I didn't have a place to put my books. Like that's where it all started. But then it unpacked into like, I own a house and I'm an adult. Why don't I have a place to put my stuff? Like that was like my tipping point for me. And it went into like, okay, like I feel like I'm like just, like treading water all the time. And right. So I think for me, that's why when I think about it in the form of self-care, right? Because self-care is something that I really lean into. I can understand that, and I can unpack that, and I can prioritize that. But for whatever reason, for 15 or 20 years, I didn't include boundaries and my own needs as part of that self-care. Self-care was always like yoga or meditation or going out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so for me, it's bringing that connection back in around, okay, like being clear on what I need and what I need to feel good in terms of my relationships or in terms of my schedule is a form of self-care, right? And if I'm not clear on what my need is, then I need to take that time and figure that out, because I'm not caring for myself the way that I need to be as a responsible adult. If I just continue to live this churn of life, right? Like different priorities that maybe are misaligned, but I just don't notice it.
Talk
Scrolling,
about it. Yeah. Yeah. I have a similar, right now I've been learning that my version of all this is simply verbalizing my emotions to people around me. Something I never really knew how to do. And yeah, I mean, of course, the stuff's evolving over time. It's not like I've never thought about boundaries before, but it's a new and deeper iteration of it lately, where I'm going, oftentimes, because my default mode was to stuff emotion, move past it, is acknowledging it. And that could be a whole episode right there, but there's so much that can happen then, as you know, as a result of acknowledging it. Yeah. And I wasn't doing that first step. So then, of course, the other following steps couldn't happen.
That reminds me too, another piece that's so important about boundaries that we haven't gotten to yet is around verbalizing it, right? Because no one can read our minds, right? So once we've done that internal work for ourselves, what are we doing with that information then? And me too, Steve, like that can be really hard to let people know what that boundary is. Maybe there's a why in there, maybe there isn't, but then maintaining that boundary, because it's so much easier to not ruffle feathers or, not create those waves and just feel like, okay, like this is the way the dynamic is. And so it's much easier to just live in that. But continuing to be in misalignment is way more painful than having that difficult conversation. So that's been my aha moment of, okay, like if it feels uncomfortable enough, it's time to do something about it. Right? Because over time, then I get like, you get a little bit bitter, and I don't like those things festering inside me. So I'd rather just, deal with it, maybe just uncomfortable, and that's okay. But at least we can move on, and I'll at least feel better that I've gotten what I needed off my chest. And then now I've got the other people as part of this solution and going forward as well.
Yeah. And sharing those boundaries verbally, same way, sharing them verbally with those around you so they can help you in maintain, not in just like an accountability sense, but so they can help you because they're on the lookout for it too. And we've been doing a lot of that at Greenhouse recently. I've been doing it in my personal life. We're just sharing with each other what we're trying to pay attention to, where we're trying to care for ourselves. Then you can help each other better. So if you have a good team, I think that's a great place to do it with family, close friends, like your personal board of directors, people who are around you in the day to day and can help.
Yes.
Okay, we could go on forever, but people already know that they can access coaching around this topic if they want to work with you or another greenhouse coach. And they can also check out the video lesson if they want to just dive deeper on their own. So I think what might be helpful to end on is if someone is listening to this and they had some kind of light bulb moment of their own or something resonated, as a coach, what would you say to them, since we're going to hang up and they don't get any more?
On this topic, yeah. I think the thing I would leave with everybody is that, boundaries is boundaries. It's a word that's become a hot word for whatever reason. But at the end of the day, it comes down to needs. And I think what I would say is, and what I've learned most recently has been, your needs are your needs and they are important, right? So it's so much easier to think about other people's needs and prioritize that and be so selfless. But to your point, Steve, like if we do that for too long and we start pouring from an empty cup, then we're actually not doing anybody any good. And so it's okay to be a little bit selfish within reason and, with balance, to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves the same way that we take care of others.